Through the use of drop shadows, you can help make your layout more lifelike, similar to what paper scrapbooking looks like.
Is it good?
Click to add the default drop shadow in Photoshop. And I know not everyone uses it, but I don't want you to use any preset. I just want you to use what the drop shadow is set in Photoshop. And these are those settings. So the default drop shadow is blend mode, is multiply. Opacity is at 75%. Angles at 45 degrees. Global light is checked on. And the distance and size are both at 5 pixels.
And she's talking the full version of Photoshop.
Yeah, I have the full version. So my default drop shadow settings, if I just click drop shadow, this is what those settings are.
And my default was 120.
Yeah, so was mine. Yeah. Change it around, make it look like this for the purpose of this tutorial. An element may be something completely different as well.
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't know what element is.
I have no idea what this is.
Are we actually making a layout? Is that what we're doing?
Nope, we're just gonna.
We're just playing?
We're just playing.
I have a blending mode for drop shadow in here, do we?
It multiply. Photoshop Elements defaults to multiply. But you don't have a choice to change.
You don't have a choice to change. Yeah, I don't know. I've never.
What's global light mean?
Yeah, a lot of them sound like they do. I don't know why mine didn't. Do we all have this right here? You have this default, this basic drop shadow right here.
Do you want us, if that's not our default, do you want us to put that in?
You know, we're going to play off of this, so if you can, great. If you can't change them, because I think someone said that it doesn't change.
She could be a follower, not the other way down.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, okay? We're going to come back to what you're doing on your thing, so just leave it. So we're going to talk about the difference. So like I said, the default drop shadow is usually at multiply. And we're going to talk about the difference of multiply versus linear burn. So most scrapbookers use multiply. Once again, like I said, this is my opinion, and I'm not necessarily right, and you may think one looks better over the other. But for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to talk about how I do my drop shadows. And with my drop shadows, I use linear burn. I have never used, well, I probably did at the very beginning, multiply. So I think linear burn makes all the difference in your layout. And this is why I think linear burn makes all the difference. Is multiply produces a darker color within the composite image and creates contrast. Now linear burn also produces darker colors within the composite image, but the difference is that linear burn breaks the bottom layer into its own individual color channel. Those are your RGB, which is your red, green, and blue channels, and this helps determine the darkness for each pixel in the top layer. Channel information for each color is used, and the darkest color's intensity is increased by a certain degree. Shadows with linear burn will have more variation throughout, depending on the colors underneath it. And that's why I use linear burn. And I know it doesn't make sense, but we can look at it when we start playing a little bit more.
Before you go on, is there a way in Photoshop Elements to change linear burn? I mean, we don't have that in Photoshop Elements to do linear burn or multiply.
If you put the shadow on a layer by itself, and I have a trick for that. If you go to my blog.
I have learned how to do that. So, okay, that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, you'd have to, yeah.
Light source and shadow color. Now, here's where I know I see a lot of layouts, and once again, it doesn't matter which direction you go, but I like all my shadows to come from the lower right-hand corner and go up, and that's just my preference. And it doesn't matter if you want yours to go to the right bottom, or the left bottom, or the right top, or any direction you want your light shadow, it's fine, as long as it's in the same direction. And that's the main thing here, okay? I prefer my angle to between -42 and -45 degrees. Once again, I'm talking about the way I like my shadow to go. I think most of the ones I've seen today, the drop shadow is in the opposite direction, but I like mine to go up this way. Now I've heard drop shadow should be black or dark gray, and I still use black myself all the time. I read somewhere that using a deep orange color that looks black to the naked eye is better, and this is the number that they use for that dark orange color. And I've tried it, and I can't, of course, tell the difference, but people swear left and right that it really does make a difference. We're going to play with it, and we'll see if it really does.
Hey, wait, what's that you meant?
We're going to come to that number again.
Okay. Too bad.
So here we have, let's do it.
Pepper.
Add the same large flower to the other side of your original flower that you just did. So your first flower that we just set had the multiply. We said we did it at 75, 45 degrees. Global light was checked, and I think we said 45 degrees, and it says negative 45. It's okay. It was 45. Distance and pixels are fine. On this next one, we're going to change it. So on your next flower, if you can change your default blend mode, you want to change it to linear burn, your opacity to 44, and we're actually not, I don't know where my negative 44 is coming. Angle to negative 44, so now we're changing that light source in my preferred direction, just for the purpose of this tutorial. If you don't like it, you can do it the other way. Make sure global light is unchecked. Change your distance to 20 and your size to 27. And then you have that little box that's probably gray or maybe black. We're going to change that to that orange color that I said we read about, the 2C1901. So when I see majority of you looking towards me, we'll continue. So go ahead and get that taken care of.
Oh, there. Like I never changed my watch. So you don't do anything spread?
Not yet. No.
How do you do it?
I don't know if I know what spread is. Is it an element thing?
No, it's a
Or
size.
the distance of your shadow?
Because there's
Oh, right.
spread
Distance.
size.
I never did. That's always a 0 on mine.
Okay. I do. I play with it sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Like I said, no one's drop shadows are wrong, and no one's drop shadows are more right than someone else. As long as your direction is all the same, it's fine. We're just. It's hard to tell you how to do drop shadows when everyone likes their own drop shadows, but.
I don't like mine.
I like my drop shadows. So.
I like other people.
I like mine. I like how I have them, but that doesn't necessarily mean mine are right.
Right.
It's just how I like what my layouts look like with them. And as you're doing that, I'm just going to talk. So your first flower was just the default drop shadow that Photoshop had. And then all we're doing is just changing it a little bit and making it more. And as you can tell from the two flowers up here on the screen or on your own screen, that one's starting to look a little bit better, more realistic, and fun to look at than the other one does.
Will you send us this PowerPoint also?
Yes. I will email it after.
I have to say that dark orange does not look that much different.
No, now, like I said, it says to the naked eye that you can't tell, but supposedly when you're printing, and like I said, I haven't really compared my print side to side or made one black and one with this dark orange to see if it makes much more of a difference, but from what I read, people, at least the places I've gone to, have really stressed the importance of using this dark orange color, and I still use black, so, but we're playing with the orange for this tutorial.
Well, I mean, I knew that, I knew there was the using the seven colors. I knew there was all the beads.
Okay, I'm going to continue.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
A couple things when you're doing your drop shadows, you want to make sure you always have global light unchecked. Now, and maybe someone can answer this for me, but I don't know. What does global light really do? I don't know, that's why I'm asking. I just read keep global light off always, and I'm like, oh, okay, check. Don't put it on.
Why?
But I don't know why. I haven't seen what it does. Does anyone know? Has anyone ever played with that global light to see if it makes a difference?
I think it makes, if you have it checked, then for some reason, like all your, like whatever you change, then all your shadows will be in that same direction or whatever. It has something to do with all, like every layer having the same direction of light.
I thought it was more like if you were looking, when I thought of global light, like if you were looking
down on
light
it?
bulb straight above, and you would
And then it
and the
disperses
light
your
was
lit?
straight down, and it was just completely.
If
That's
by
what I always thought.
chance you do not fall under the category that knows what global lighting is, global lighting is a feature that gives the appearance of a global light source that shines on the entire PSD file in a constant angle. It
Okay.
affects things like drop shadows, inner shadows, bubbles, etc.
If you have
So you
global,
get a drop shadow that goes all around instead of just
no,
up?
no. If you have global light checked on every layer, it changes every layer when you move
When
it.
you move one drop shadow.
When you move one drop shadow, if you uncheck it, then when you change it, it only applies to that one.
Okay, so with global light unchecked, you can change each element's drop shadow, make it more thick or make it more look like it's coming up. So if you have global light checked, then all your drop shadows are going to be exactly the
It's only regarding light source, whether your light is coming from the
left or
upper
the right?
right or yeah.
Right.
The angle. It only affects the angle.
Yes, the angle.
Well, for good practice, always just make sure it's unchecked. Okay? Then we won't have any problems. Depending on your element will depend on what your distance and size sliders will be. We're going to focus on 3 key areas that play an important role on your drop shadows: the distance, size, and opacity. And cast shadows, we're going to cover cast shadows just a little bit, but it only works for CS2 and above. And I know you can, with elements that have more to do with brushing and adding your shadows that way, and I've never used elements, so I don't know. But we will cover it a little bit for those who have CS. Adding distance depends on how realistically something will sit off your page. The more distance you add, the more the object will appear not to be attached to the page. When using folding ribbons, flowers, or any object that cannot be glued realistically all the way to the page, it is a good thing to go ahead and add a little more distance. So, when you stick a flower on a paper scrapbook page, is every single one of those petals going to be down? Not really, right? Just play around with it. The further left you go, the less distance. The further right you go, the more distance you get. Size. You want to add size to drop shadows, but just barely. This will give the shadow a slight blur. Not too much, just a faint hint of a blur, and this adds to the realism. Opacity. Now that you have distance and size, now depending on your background color, you can play with how dark or light your shadows should be. Light backgrounds need a lighter shadow on objects. Unless the object is heavy, then only slightly darker, like a smaller button. Smaller objects need a darker shadow as well, sometimes 100%. The dark shadow on small objects gives these objects depth and dimension. Dark backgrounds, unless you want to completely lose that fabulous shadow you just made, need a darker shadow. So, we have a string on a light-colored background, and each one has been changed a little bit more. So the first string is just the string on the paper. It's just plain, flat, nothing's there. The second string has a negative 45 degree, and that's, like I said, just my preference of the way I like my drop shadows to go. The next one, we added distance to create more depth. Then we added size to give it a slight more blur. And then we adjusted opacity depending on the color of the background. So as you can tell, it just made it a little bit more lighter. So when you're playing with your elements on your layout, depending on what look you're going for, it depends on what you're changing for those drop shadows. And it just says the lighter the background paper, the lighter the shadow should be. Unless it's heavy or small, then it's darker. So just something to remember. All right. Now you're going to make a couple presets for drop shadows that you can use, and then you can change them however you want. And if you don't like that, we'll just go through it. So make a new layout, open 2 papers, and drag them both to that layout. You're not saving this layout. Don't make them pretty. Any 2 papers will do. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and open up all the steps. And like I said, I did this in Photoshop CS, so I'm not sure how it's going to apply to Elements. So if you're following along in Elements and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do,
I'll holler.
Yeah, holler.
You can't create styles.
In Elements?
No.
Oh.
That's why they're in such high demand.
Okay, so those who
stores.
have CS in here, who's using CS? Those who have CS, after you create these styles, we'll have someone email them out. Okay, so everyone who has Elements can get these same drop shadow presets that we're creating.
There's some things on page. I should scrap. I should scrap.
Yeah, and you can change this however you want. This is what my preset is for papers. So when I do a drop shadow on my paper, this is my basic one. So if I'm scrapping quickly, this is what I use. I click on this preset for my paper and I call it good. And then depending if it's a dark paper or a light paper, I play around with a little bit. Or sometimes I may just be too lazy and I just leave it as is. If you don't like the -44, go ahead and make it, just regular 44. It's your preference, but these are the basic ones.
Well, like I said, I am forcing myself to learn these kinds of. Do I have to go, in Elements I went and clicked on, do I have to go up to layer every time, layer style, drop shadow every single time?
Just double click on the little icon in the.
Yeah.
In your layers
palette. On the very
palette.
bottom, the layers palette has the new layers like a square with the, I don't have mine.
FX.
Yeah,
just click on the little FX.
layers. There we go.
Oh, yay.
Light bulb moment.
Light bulb.
It does. Yeah, down here.
Oh, the
FX?
Okay.
Click on that. Sorry, I knew that was worth asking, because there usually is a better answer.
There's always a shortcut somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes. Those who have CS, is there anyone still making this drop shadow preset? Is
I am,
everyone good?
Brianna and I were working.
Yeah,
on it. Sorry.
Okay, will you let me know when you're
I'm
done?
remedial, so go ahead and go on and I'll.
No, it's okay.
Do you have that? Oh, you still use Slack and stuff.
This, for the purpose of this, let's use that 2C. Did someone write it down really quick? You know, I said 2C.
No, I didn't.
1901.
Yeah. If you want to have that as part of your preset, go ahead and put that in. And I would love, to find out later down the road if anyone wants to post it in the forum or even email me and say, hey, I printed my layout with the dark orange in
I'm
it.
sorry, what was it?
1901.
Yeah, 2C 1901.
It looked good. I just did.
You liked it better than the black? Yeah, I would love to see what it looks like really printed to see what you see.
So is this now going to be saved?
Yes. So now you have a paper preset.
Where does it go?
In your
style.
In your style.
In my style?
In your box. I'm going to continue, I guess. Yep. All right. And the next one you're making is a bulky element preset. So add a large element to your lovely layout, okay? And then follow these steps. So the angle has, the opacity changed. The angle is the same, because like I said, I like all my angles to go at negative 44, between 42, 45, 44 is where I usually stay. You're making your distance and size bigger. Of course, you're leaving your global light unchecked. And that's pretty much the only thing that's changing on this one. So these would be for your bulkier elements. If I really want to add a lot of shadow to my elements, I'll use this one a lot of times, especially on big flowers. Leaves, I like it on leaves. Once again, it's preference. It's what you like. So when you play, after we get these basic presets made and we email them out, you can play around with them on a layout, and you can go from here on the shadows you would like to use on your layout. Is everyone caught up? The next one is a smaller element preset. And you're going to double click on that drop shadow that you just created for your flower so you can change it. And once you get these, the opacity, distance, size, and everything changed, you're gonna save this one as well. And this one's going to be your smaller element drop shadow. Once again, you notice the opacity is a little darker, but because it's smaller, the distance and size is smaller. Are we all caught up on this one?
So where will how do I find that one when I made? Where do I go?
So underneath your layers of the flower,
Yeah.
it has your drop shadow layer. You double click on that, and it's going to open up your shadow preset, and you can just change the settings, and then when you resave it, you give it a new name. Is that what you're asking?
Well,
So be in your style swatches, that is going to be in your style.
Oh, like where is it at after you create it? Yes.
Do you have your,
Thank you, Deb.
and they just break squares because
yeah, they weren't showing me the name.
Yeah, when you hover your mouse over it, when you put your mouse over it, it should show a little name underneath the box, or it will eventually show it. So, okay, I'm going to move on. The next one is a string preset. Add a string, preferably a string, not a super small element, just to make sure. It doesn't really matter. But add a string, and then make these settings on your drop shadows, and call it the string drop shadow. want me to go back so you can
No,
see it?
I can get it later. I don't want to make it on.
Is everyone caught up on this one? Is there anyone who's not done with this step? Okay. And this one's called the opposite edge preset. Sometimes even with paper scrapbooking, you can still see a slight shadow on the opposite edge from the light source coming in. And when I use this, I do not like my corners to be flat. If there's a corner showing, I almost always, I really do, add this opposite edge preset. And the only reason I do is I like to have that little something more on my layout to make it more realistic, so I don't have it all going in one corner and nothing happening on the other corner. So I give it a slight shadow, and if you go through my gallery, you'll see most of my layouts will have that slight shadow on that edge in the opposite corner. I'm sure I can find one in a bit. So double click to change your element shadow and change it to these following presets. And in my gallery, I just made a layout of my daughter playing in the sand in Oregon. And I did apply the opposite edge shadow to everything there. So if you are in the Stuff to Scrap gallery and you are in my gallery, you will see that's my last layout, and you'll see it in there if you want to look. But we can open it up later too if we need to. And of course, it's my preference, so you may not like it, so you don't have to use it, but sometimes it's nice. And if you ever have a paper that you have one light source, and so you have a paper that, like we did at the speed scrap, where we put another paper over and cut a slice out of it, and then you have your shadow only showed on one part of that, on that paper. And so what I would do is I then merge it with the blank layer, which I'm sure there's an easier way, but that's how I do it. And then I add this second drop shadow, so now both parts of my paper have a drop shadow to it. Is everyone caught up on this one?
Mm-hmm. What did you say your layout was?
Maybe it's not there and I lied.
Well, mine isn't sorting by posting date. I don't know why. So I can't find it.
We'll open it. Okay, sorry, apparently I didn't give you the rest of the steps, but after you've called it the drop edge shadow, it says if you click on an item, and you can do this yourself, so click on the item, you want to give a slight definition to it on the opposite edge, whether it's a flower or one of your papers or something like that, so you can see it. I merge it with my first drop shadow layer, so I have my layer with a paper and the drop shadow underneath, and then I'll create a blank layer, and it will be either on top or bottom, it doesn't matter, and then I merge those two layers together. And I'm sure there's an easier way, and you guys can tell me, because I just don't know, but that gets rid of that drop shadow.
Can you simplify the layering?
You can do that, yeah. I'm just so used to doing it this way that it's the fastest way for me to do it. Unless there's a shortcut key, and I should probably really learn it. But anyways, that's how I apply my opposite edge drop shadows on my papers and my layout. Now cast shadow. So this one is again in CS and above. You can manipulate your drop shadows even more to create realism that was previously achieved only with careful and time-consuming brushwork. So if you have elements, you may do this already, but CS2 came up with this cast shadow thing, and it's amazing. So shadows should appear attached to the object at the point where the object touches the page, and then appear to grow further away from the object as the object pops out from the page. In CS2 and above, you can manipulate your shadows by erasing parts of it, blurring it, changing its color, and even using the warp tool to create great cast shadows. So those with CS, this is only something you can do. You're going to duplicate your second flower that you have with the better drop shadow. You can delete those, the string you have on there if you want, and the paper. We're not going to be using those anymore. So just you have your 2 flowers on that neutral colored paper. That second one with the better drop shadow is the one we're going to manipulate for those with CS and above. Or CS2 and above. Right click on that FX symbol in your layers box and choose Create Layer. If a message comes up, go ahead and just say OK. With the shadow layer active, choose Edit, Transform, and Warp. And when Hummy was saying that she made like the faces in that picture big, was that with the warp at all? I don't know how elements.
Because they don't have warp and elements. That's
Okay.
done with the liquify filter.
Liquify? Okay, so if you wanted to do that in CS and above, I mean, this would be the same thing, taking your family picture and you can warp it. But in this case, you're doing it with your drop shadow layer to create the cast shadow. Click and drag your mouse to pull at the grid until you see the shadows appear from underneath the object. So then, can you see what's pulling when you pull on those? You see those shadows moving? Those who don't have CS, if you want to look at someone's laptop who has CS, just to kind of see what they're pulling and playing with, raise your hand if you have CS so those can look if they want to. It's really kind of neat how you can move those drop shadows around. Says, be sure to consider your light source so the direction of the shadow stays consistent with the highlight and shadows within the object. So if your drop shadow is coming from the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to have more shadow coming from where? The top left-hand corner. So you just need to make sure you keep that in consideration. Once you have your shadow looking pretty good, go ahead and hit Enter. And it doesn't have to be pretty. This, of course, is for fun. So make it crazy, whatever you want. And hit Enter. Then, using a soft eraser and an opacity on that eraser between 25 and 50%, you're going to erase just the very edges of some of the shadows. Because like I said, the shadows are darker closer to the object, and the further away those shadows get, the lighter the shadow is. So if you erase just some of that dark shadow on the very edges, where you just pulled some of those drop shadows away, you're just making it look even more realistic. Shadows should appear darkest where they touch the object and grow lighter as they move away. So we have 3 flowers. The first one on the left side is the basic drop shadow from what Photoshop had. The second one was, that might be the bulky element preset that you just created. And the third one, I used that warp to create the cast shadows and just pull some of the shadows on that side, the left top side, out a little bit more. And then using that soft eraser brush, I erased just the tips of some of those drop shadows. Can you see my mouse if I do that? So you can see just right around here, along those very tops of those drop shadows, they're lighter. So you have a little bit lighter and then it goes darker. And that's what you're doing to create more realistic shadows. On this, when you created your layers option, it's not limited. You can use it on bevel and emboss and outer glow. Creating layers from these effects gives you much more control over the placement of your objects. With a little bit of practice, you can create layouts that people want to reach out and touch because they look so real. Here are some tips for some great shadows. Always keep the direction of light the same. Keep the size proportional for the size of the object. The bigger the space between the object and its shadow, the lighter the shadow will be. The shadow for a piece of paper placed directly on the top of another piece of paper will be darker than a button or flowers on that paper. Play with your blend mode. Just because I like multiply or linear burn or whatever ones you want, play around with them on your elements and see what they look like. Using the color burn mode when applying shadows to acrylic works best. So if you ever use acrylic element, that's something to take note of. The closer to the background, the crisper, smaller, and darker the shadow will be. The further away from the background, the blurrier, larger, and lighter the shadow will be. Viewing your layout with at least 25% zoom will give you a realistic idea of how the layout will look when printed. So if you want to look at your drop shadow, zoom in at least 25% to see what it's looking like. There's another site called Scrapbook Campus, and they had some fun examples that I wanted to go over. Let me just go past it. So they have 14 things, and they have little pictures to go with them on the mistakes people make in digital scrapbooking, and whether or not you've made any of these mistakes and dare to admit it, or not, they're kind of fun and good thing to know about. Shadows in different directions. Here we have 2 buttons on a layout, let's say. Can you see what's wrong with the first one? Although in real life you can have multiple light sources, they should always shed the same light on elements of a page, whether it is a thin ribbon, or a thick button, or a flower. Consistency is a key factor, as shadows are part of what our brain needs to interpret the information it gathers. Is this element thick or thin? Is this element stuck on the page or lifted? So if we're putting our drop shadows in different directions, it's just confusing.
And if you click global, it'll keep them all in the same direction.
There you go. Shadows and light on the same side. So sometimes you get these elements that have a pretty obvious light source, and on that first one you can see where the light source is on the element, and then they applied the drop shadow on the wrong side. How many of you have done that before? Right, I have too. So it's something to keep an eye out, because if you're buying elements or using elements, especially designers who are purchasing elements with these obvious light sources, you want to make sure you're keeping those shadows realistic and putting them on the other side of that light source. Shadows are created by a light source, which means that each element will have one spot facing the source that will be somewhat lighter or have a bright spot, while the opposite side will have a darker edge and a shadow. Some elements you get in kits have very obvious light sources, okay? Therefore, the shadow has to go on the other side to be realistic. Spin it around in a circle and fix it. Don't just